Hello, howdy. Welcome to officehours.fm, episode 98. That's only 2 episodes away from episode 100 for those of you who are math fiends out there, and I'm pretty excited about that. But before we get there, we're going to have an awesome episode today. I have the one, the only Chris Lema. How are you today, sir?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing well. It is always a pleasure to chat with you. And you've been on the show before, but it's been a while. And you know what? The listeners were just clamoring. I mean, literally, I had to take out a restraining order because they were clamoring at my door to get you back on the show. So I appreciate you coming on today and quieting the masses.
I'm glad for that.
Whew. So before we dive in, a couple of notes for everybody. First, I want to very much thank today's sponsors. We've got Pantheon, who is giving away a free webinar to listeners for how to scale a high traffic WordPress site. I'll tell you more about that later. And then we've also got web.com. You may know them as Network Solutions. They have a secure WordPress feature that I'm going to share with you about later. So stay tuned for that. If you're tuning into the show live, I would love for you to be able to interact with Chris and myself. And you can do that via Twitter by using the hashtag OfficeFM. Or if you're over on the Googles, use the Google Q&A app and you can send those in. So, without further ado, didn't there used to be like a Coca-Cola commercial where they did that?
I think there was. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to send them a sponsorship invoice later. All right. So, Chris, where do we even start with you? So, here's the thing. When we talked about topics for today's episode, you could talk about any number of topics and share your wisdom greatly. But there is one topic that comes back to the root of all the topics, and that is storytelling. Like, for instance, if I was to ask you, Chris, tell me about pricing my services, or Chris, tell me how to best estimate a project, or Chris, how do I do XYZ? You would start your answer by saying, let me tell you a story. So today, I'm thrilled to have you on to discuss what exactly storytelling is and how you can use it, or how my listeners can use it, both to help kind of maybe grease that initial communication, if you will, with potential customers or peers, and then ultimately use that as a tool in selling. So with that, I guess we should back up. Chris, it's possible that somebody listening to the show hasn't met you. So let me give you a moment to introduce yourself.
My name is Chris Lema. I blog over at chrislema.com, and I'm in the last couple of days of being the Chief Technology Officer at a company called Crowd Favorite, which is an agency that does WordPress development for enterprises. And I'm a coach and advisor for a lot of different WordPress product companies. And I'm on the occasionally, not every week, on the WP Water Cooler show on Monday mornings. So that's all the ways you can find me. And of course, I'm on Twitter at Chris Lema.
So basically, yeah, if somebody can't find you, that is not for lack of your availability on the interwebs.
You can Google memberships and WordPress and see if you find me. Also,
Google, I say no a lot.
That's right.
And I think you come up number one with a blog post there.
Yeah.
Okay, so last year, you came out to WordCamp Dallas-Fort Worth, and you actually keynoted our camp, and you told a story about stories. Let's start with, I'm putting you on the spot here if you remember that presentation, but putting you on the spot just to recap a little, because you were talking about your story, like our personal stories, not a story to introduce a topic, but our personal stories. Could you share a little bit about that?
Sure. So one of the things that I do with folks that are either freelancers, consultants, small businesses, is I'll ask them, what's your story, right? And they look at me with a blank stare, right? And you realize that what we liked about, comic books, what we liked about movies is rarely what's going to happen next. It's more often, how did we get here? It's the origin story, right? When you hear Batman's origin story or Spider-Man's origin story, everything makes more sense. And additionally, it's compelling, right? The reason Spider-Man was maybe the most beloved comic book hero ever was because he was a teenager, right? And so teenagers reading comic books were like, oh my gosh, I too might one day be Spider-Man, which is highly unlikely, but it's aspirational, right? And so people were like, this is interesting. So when I talk to people about their origin story, more often than not, they don't have one. And not only do they not have one, they've never thought of it. So what happens is when you don't have a compelling story, when you haven't done the work to think through your own story, now what are you competing on when you're talking to a prospective customer? Because you show up and you're like, I can build a website for $1,000, or I can build a website for $500 or $5,000, whatever it is. And the next guy can put a price next to their efforts too. And then everybody has effort and everybody has an hourly rate. And so there's nothing that differentiates you. But the moment you say, here's the thing, I was homeless. And when I was homeless, I started learning how to do, WordPress, and it brought me out of my homelessness. And now I'm living in this apartment, and for the last 2 years, I've been working on nonprofit websites that specifically cater to the homeless. And the person on the other end of the table is like, I feel connected in a different way. And by all means, I'm going to pick you to build my website. And I'm going to pick you over the 3 other people I talk to, even if your price is slightly higher or if it's lower or whatever. It's because I feel a connection. The connection isn't the work you do. The connection is the story you told, right? So what I was trying to share in Dallas was that everybody has a story. Every single person has a story. Now, sometimes your story is simply, I help these people become these people by doing this thing, right? And there's a formula to it that you can structure. Other times it's, I learned my craft by having solved this problem over and over again. Or it may simply be, I know exactly where you are because years ago I had that problem, but I found the bridge to cross over that river. I know how to get to the other side and I can help you get over it. Like whatever framework you use, you still need a story. So that's what I was trying to get across in Dallas.
Well, you did an excellent job at it. And it was a very memorable presentation, although I couldn't have recapped it as beautifully as you just did, but that's because I'm not a master storyteller. I was having a brunch with some fellow WordPress folks here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and we were discussing a book I recently read, and it's called Start With Why. And Stephanie, one of the listeners, kind of summed it up beautifully as to the point you were just making, all things being considered equal. So your effort, your cost, your capability, all those things, if all those things are equal across the board, the person that someone feels the most connection with is the person that they will choose to do business with. So I think it's very compelling to think about it that way. And I don't know, something I haven't really thought much of until recently.
Yeah, Simon Sinek, the author of that book, made a lot more money saying that than I did. I mean, just to be clear.
Well, I'm going to send him a sponsorship invoice and I'll cut the check with you. How about that?
That's right. That's perfect.
But yeah, ooh, excuse me, I was muted. So that's what you're talking about there is a personal story. So let's
and that's one kind of story, and that's one place story takes place is with the why, right? What's my background? What's my origin story? But that's really only one place where story plays into it, right? A space that you know very well and I know very well is when we're pitching a customer, right? We're trying to get them to buy our services. And if you have listeners who are freelancers or agencies, small agencies, boutiques that are selling services, they all get to the same place where they have to articulate, what it's going to cost to do something. And most of them have actually had a personal experience buying something expensive, and yet they completely forgot about it because at the default, most freelancers and agencies and small businesses, they're not in sales. They're like, I'm a designer, I'm an engineer, I'm a something, but very few people are like, I decided to start a boutique or an agency because I'm a salesperson. And you're like, okay, I don't hear that story very often. So we've all gone through buying something, right? Now you have to have bought something really expensive, so expensive that often you can't pay for it in one shot. right? So we're not talking about something that you can go into a store and write a check for, or run your credit card or ATM card and be done. I'm talking about something that often comes with, say, installment payments, right? And the people who are selling you those things, they've not read Kahneman, they've not read Aureli, they haven't done the research, they don't know behavioral psychology, they just know what works, right? It's the school of hard knocks for them. But you try and bring in a guy who's going to sell you on why their company should build your pool in your backyard, right? I had this experience 2 years ago where I brought a guy in, and I've had several other, like when you buy a car, a expensive car, or when you buy a pool or an addition to a house, right? I think that was maybe the first time that I ever heard it. I was maybe 12 or 14 when my parents bought hired a contractor to build an addition to our house so my grandmother could come live with us. And the guy who was talking to my dad started talking about the Johnson house. I don't know if you've ever bought anything big. I don't know if you've ever hired someone to build you a pool or an extension, but there's always the Johnson house. And maybe it has a different name, but the Johnson house is where that salesperson gets to tell you about what they did for someone else, right? It's a notion of social proof that today we cheat social proof, right? Because someone told us, put someone else's logo on your website and you get social proof. That's not social proof. Social proof is really about telling the compelling story so that trust transfers, right? When you tell the story of the Johnson house and you're like, so at the Johnson house, we had a similar problem as what you guys have, right? And you have a similar layout, and we have to cut back into the hill to be able to put the pool in this way. But this is what we've done, and they casually drop the price of the Johnson house, right? They casually drop it. And what they're doing is called anchoring, right? Because when they tell you the Johnson house and they say, now that pool cost $100,000, and they're watching for you to either relax because you thought it was going to be $200,000 to cut into the back of your hill, or tighten up because $100,000 is way more than you were expecting. But here's the thing. Let's say you were imagining $30,000. And the very nature of him anchoring you to $100,000 is that now he'll see right away, and he'll say right away. Now, I'm not suggesting that your pool will cost you that, right? But with the Johnson house, we did have to solve that problem. Now, there's some ways that we can do this slightly different for you. And he adjusts the message in the story, but he told you about the Johnson house. He anchored you. And now when he comes to you with 50, you're already in the place of thinking, well, at least it's not 100, instead of thinking, well, what I had budgeted was 30. I don't know if you've ever bought a house, but people who buy houses, right, and they go in, especially if the house hasn't been built, right? If you're buying a new house, you go into the sales office and they have floor plans and maybe they have a couple models. But when you walk in, the salesperson starts immediately anchoring you, right? And so what happens? They anchor you on the lowest price of their expensive models. And you may have had before, when you were talking to your husband, your wife, you were talking to your partner, and you're like, okay, we really can't buy a house more than $120,000. And they come in and they start talking about, it's $150,000, but it has a loft and a guest room. And you start thinking about your uncle that comes over and visits like once a year. And suddenly that becomes worth the additional $30,000 because you talk yourself into like, okay, but this is and what they're doing is they're planting a story. This is inception-like behavior. They're planting a story in your head because suddenly they're like, I don't know how many guests you have over. And immediately you're like, well, yeah, Uncle Bill comes over every now and then. And you inflate the story in your own head of how many guests you're going to have. And suddenly it becomes worth spending 150 instead of 120.
Something I'd like to highlight there is what you're talking about is not manipulation. What you're doing is painting a story of what things cost. Because I know for a lot of people who are doing design or development work, it's, the people that are coming to us for these services. And even at the crowd favorite enterprise level, people don't understand what these services cost. So to be able to tell a story about a time that I did a site like this, and that was a $15,000 site. And I know that's not quite what you need, but I did that, and that was the cost on that. And then come back around. I mean, exactly your pool story just retold in a web format. It's not a way to necessarily try to squeeze more out of it. It's simply a way to add some, like you said, an anchor, some context to the discussion of price.
It's absolutely correct. So I'm not I mean, there are people who will use these techniques to manipulate.
For
Any
evil
technique,
purposes.
yeah, any technique can be used in different ways. But the point of the technique is to understand that it happens, right? It happens. So if you do a website for a friend, right, and you tell that friend, hey, I'm cutting you a deal because I really like you. Like, we've never done this. None of us have ever done a website for a friend at a ridiculously discounted rate. And then what do? They tell all their friends and they tell them what they paid, right? They're like, oh my God, like Carrie did this amazing job for me today and it only cost $1,000, right? And she did all these things. Like, she even took all my photos and she retouched every single one of them. And she did, she went in and she wrote 3 articles for me because I told her about it, but I didn't have time. And so, and you're thinking, I would never do this, but I did. Right? I retouched up every photo on a wedding blog or a wedding site. And I wrote 2 articles on a chiropractic website, right? I didn't even know massage. And then I had to go learn massage so I could write the articles. We've all been there and did it for that one person that you're like, I like you so much. I want you to get a start and moving forward. So let me come along. And then they go tell someone else. And they anchored that person so that when that person shows up and say, I want exactly what you gave them. And here's my $500, here's my $1,000, here's my whatever, right? I mean, at Crowd Favorite, we did a project for a larger entity, but we did a very scoped down, very focused project, a lot of constraints around it. And we did it for $15,000 when normally it would have been $50,000. And we did it because we knew there was additional relationship there, et cetera. But the business unit right next door to them showed up and said, I want all these things and I want it for the same price. People anchor. It doesn't matter who they are. It doesn't matter what the context is. People anchor. So you need to learn how to tell the right stories so that people get anchored to the right numbers, the numbers that do make sense. And one of the ways you do that is by telling the right stories, right? Selecting the stories that make the most sense to share in that process. There's another angle of story that we haven't talked about, and that is the story that the customer is telling. And more often than not, we never hear it, right? More often than not, we cut them off before they ever tell us a story. A customer comes to you and says, hi, Carrie, I love your theme and I want to use your theme on my new site. And I would like you to customize, and I want you to do, and they tell us explicitly what they want. I want you to change the sidebar, and I want you to add me one new template, and I want to do, I want to add a pricing grid to it. And you, like, what's our default? Our default answer is, what's that going to cost, right? We go back and say, okay, well, it'll take a few hours to do this, that. And we never stop to say, wait, back up. Tell me what you're doing. Tell me what your business is. Tell me what you're about. Tell me, because we don't even know if the things that they've listed are things that their cousin or nephew told them to do. We don't know if it's, what another friend told them they did on their site. We don't even know if it's the right thing to do. And just because you can do it doesn't mean you should do it, right? And so you have to back up and say, I need to hear your story. At Crowd Favorite for the last year and a half, I've been on a ridiculous number of calls where clients are telling us about their business and what they need and what we're gonna quote for them, whatever. And I was talking to our COO the other day, and he said, Chris, one of the things I really am impressed by all the time is that you can jump from one call to the next call to the next call, and you just remember everything about that project when we're having a follow-up call with that client. And I said, well, can I tell you the trick, right? Is on that first call, I really pushed the client to tell us their story. I pushed them to describe not just what they want us to do, but the why, their own why, and also their business model, what they're doing. And I paint that as a movie in my head, right? Like, I watch the movie as they're telling me. And as I watch the movie, there are these natural parts of the movie that I assume, and then I ask them about it, and that fleshes it out more. And so I watch the movie. And you know what happens is, and this is something that Jason could relate to, right? I'm like, Jason, when we get on a second call, it's just like remembering a movie you've seen, right? Even if it's been years, right? You remember Wall Street, you remember the important lines, you remember the main driver of the movie. Like, there's little details you don't remember, but you remember enough that you're like, okay, let's circle back to it, right? If you don't actively listen, if you don't push a customer to tell you their story, and that isn't what captivates you. If you don't really care about their story, you will end up delivering poorer performance and getting less revenue because of it. But if you compel them, invite them, and collaborate with them to tell you their story, and you listen actively and you engage in their story, well, not only will you deliver a better response, you actually will come up with other solutions at a varying different degrees of price points, and a phased approach that you might be able to say, well, for now with this budget, let's do this, but I have 4 other ideas because I now really know your story. And that's when you shift from being a vendor to a partner. And if you can shift from a vendor to a partner, you have that repeatability. That customer comes back and back and back. You have lower cost of sale. You have better revenue and better profit. Everything is better, but it starts with listening to their story and asking them to tell it.
I love it. That's gold. We could probably just end the podcast here, drop the mic, walk away. Jackie has a question that is perfectly timed for what you're talking about. She says, we've been taught to do a lot of listening when pitching to clients. So doing all this listening that you're talking about and hearing their story, when is a good time to share your story?
That's great. When you fully understand their story, their why, their objective, what mountain they're trying to climb, right? When you fully understand that, that's the moment to share not only what you recommend or what you think could be useful, but to interject your story, not only your backstory, but also the Johnson House stories, right, into your proposal. So I worked with a client once years ago who the call got escalated to me, right? So I was on an executive team, and this was all happening, with frontline folks, and it had gone up through directors, and it finally bubbled up to me, and they said, we need you to talk to the executive director because they want something and it's unreasonable and we don't know what to say. And so I got on a call, and they start telling me their problem, and they tell me predominantly they tell me their solution. We need you to do this, and we need it by this date, and I need it now. And I said, well, can you back up and tell me your story? Can you tell me what's going on? What's driving this? What are the dynamics related to this? What are the political ramifications, relational, the financial consequences? And I got that whole story. And then I turned around and I asked them, I said, well, in the history of us working together, have we ever done something where we rush code to you in 2 or 3 days, given it to you, and you've had 1 day to test it in your entire environment, and then we've activated it and there's been no issues? Like, is that a story that has ever worked in our relationship? And they're like, no. I agree with you. That's not been our story, right? The reason we've had success together is because we take our time to build something right. You put it in your environment, you test it for weeks, and then we deploy it. So let's agree that as an approach, that's a story that won't work in this case because you need something by Monday. But can we take this off the table, and can I tell you some of the other things we've done for other people that might help you here? And so I get to circle back and tell the Johnson House story, other kinds of stories, other solutions. And I present them with a completely different solution than they were ever asking for. And it turns out it was going to cost more money. And they agreed happily and thanked us for the call and went away and told a lot of other customers, I love working with these guys because they solve our core problem, right? But we solved their problem in a completely different way. And part of it was because we were able to understand the drivers and the challenges and the context. And then we were able to refashion that story to say, look, this particular narrative that we're going down is not a narrative that's going to work. So let's go find you another one. Let me tell you about some of the other stories here that could apply to you. And that's normally where I do it. After I've gotten enough from them, after we figured out, okay, now I'm going to present a solution or multiple solutions. And in that, I will tell you about the Johnson House.
That's great. I think as a technical person, and I like that you said, kind of differentiated between a vendor and a partner, somebody who executes on things versus someone who consults and helps you craft the right solution to your actual problem. I know in sitting in those kind of initial calls, getting the details, or maybe even just the initial emails, trying to read between the lines about what somebody wants or needs. And as a developer, my mind is going to, okay, I can use this plugin. This would be great to do here. Oh, I know somebody that is great with BuddyPress. I could probably, how much would it cost to subcontract them? And those are all the things I'm working on in my head. But to your point, none of those things are addressing the actual problem.
Well, more importantly, there's no way you will remember this call in 6 weeks, right? Because you were not actually listening to their story. You were listening to your own meta narrative around how you're going to solve the problem. You have jumped into the solution space, right? And what I recommend to people over and over again is, and I use the term marinate on purpose because you can't marinate a steak like in 12 minutes. I have a friend, I live in California, so we don't know anything about steak, but I have a friend who took steak, threw it in a bag of A1 steak sauce, zipped up the Ziploc bag, threw it in the fridge for 10 minutes before he took it out to the, to the grill. And I'm like, what do you call that? Right? He's like, I'm marinating the steak. I'm like, no, that's not how marinating works. Like, it needs to sit in the marinade for overnight or a day, like or more, right? And so what I recommend to people is marinate in the problem space. Sit in the problem space. Listen in the problem space. When a customer starts talking about their problems, do not imagine the solution. Instead, imagine the problem. So when the customer comes to us and says, I sell diamonds and I sell them and I want to sell them online, whatever, and you have to think through, okay, what does it mean that you're selling diamonds online? Like, so I start picturing in my mind what it looks like to sell diamonds in a store, and then I start translating that to online. And I'm asking them, so do you have salespeople that are engaging with people? How do you show the customer? And I'm asking them questions to understand their world. And also, do you have problems with inventory? Like, what happens if does the inventory move from location to location, or is it always in one place? Do you have to have people that actually physically, like, do you put the diamonds in a pouch and inside a briefcase and handcuff it to your wrist and drive it to another location? And does that mean that the inventory now has to move from point A to point B because the software now has to take care of that? And I'm painting the picture of their business in my head. I'm walking that through. I'm paying attention. So 6 weeks from now, they come back and they want to get on a call. I know everything about that movie because I watched it in my head. I've paid attention to their stuff. We haven't even gotten into our side yet. I just want to fully understand your problem. When they're finally like, oh, no, we don't do any of that, right? We do it totally different. You come here, you do this, and then we just ship you something. And you're like, oh, okay. Well, now let me ask you new questions about that. The more you know about someone's problem, the better your answer will eventually be. But that means you can't do the problem space within 30 seconds, right? Like, the problems that we're solving, this, I read this, it was a quote from someone else, so this is not my own quote, but I read it just yesterday or maybe early this morning, and it was something like, you can never expect to solve serious problems with a 30-second bright idea, right? Like, there is nothing that you can do that allows you to listen to something complex and just go, oh, what about this? Or in your head, I can use this custom post type and I can use it. Like, you're jumping so quickly into the solution that you fully don't comprehend the problem. And this is also why more than a few people misquote the effort. And when you misquote the effort, you then hate the work because you realize you're working at a deficit, right? You're not making any more money. And when you hate the work, you do a poor job. When you do a poor job, right, then ultimately the customer feels like you're doing a crappy job and you're not engaged. And when you're not engaged, they don't come back to you. So guess what? It fails on so many levels that eventually you're like, this whole industry sucks. And you're like, the industry isn't the problem. You were the problem because you started spinning off this plugin and this custom post type and this in your head instead of listening. And the more you listen, the more you get at the core of what the real problems are, what some of the hidden problems are. You also benefit from getting how they've already potentially tried to solve the problem. I sat in a meeting once. I had no idea how to quote this effort. I had no idea. They had given us just a high-level summary of something. And I sat in the meeting and I listened, and then I asked some questions. Then I listened more. Then I asked some more questions. And finally, as we were getting to the end of this, the guy said something, like, this is our fourth time trying to solve this problem. We need to really get it solved. And I went, wait a minute, what? Can you tell me the stories of the first 3 tries? Because, by the way, it may be possible that whatever I was imagining to solve this problem, you've already tried, right? I don't want to be that idiot. So tell me how you tried to solve it. And as they told me the stories, it definitely filtered out some options, and it gave me better sense of what I needed to do. But more importantly, it highlighted how important the effort was by how much they had already spent trying to solve a problem. If a problem is small and you don't care about it, you spend $100. If a problem is massive and you care a lot about it, you spend $1 million. If someone has spent $1 million and still hasn't had the problem and shows up to you and you're like, well, I think I can do this for $5,000. Well, you're an idiot, right? Because you've completely missed out on the context clues. But that all comes from marinating the problem space and asking enough to get at all the hidden stories that are back there, so that when you get ready to do it, right, you're like, okay, now here's my proposal. And this is a proposal that mitigates a bunch of those different issues that I've heard of and solves those risks, and also ensures I have some profit margin. And by the way, it means I'm going to be highly engaged during the work. I'm going to be happy to finish the work. You're going to be happy with my work, and you will likely come back for more work. That's ultimately how you do that to win.
So you bring up an interesting point in this, and all this listening. How much of this listening are you doing for free? In other words, what's the time that you kind of that initial time gauging versus the, okay, let me scope out some sort of a discovery period, or that sort of thing? How much do you give away?
So I listen for the first call, typically for free, right? Like the first call, we have a conversation. I don't have any issue. But normally in the middle of that first call, I will hear conflicts or discrepancies, right? Those are internal things to the story that don't line up, right? What do I mean by that? Someone tells me that they have a budget of $15,000 for an e-commerce site, and then they describe a feature that they've seen on Amazon. Okay, that's a discrepancy because you're matching Amazon features to non-Amazon budget. There's a lack of alignment, right? And you go, okay, okay, so I write it down. Or someone says, I want a custom, make your own, like I want this, what I want is I want this avatar, and I want you to take your picture and upload it so that you have yourself as an avatar. And then I want you to put my clothing line on your avatar, and so you can see how it fits. And you're like, I don't really know how to even do that. I don't know what my options are. But before I go into the solution space, let me go back to this. So does that mean that you have you have photos of your clothing in all different shapes and sizes? Like, do you have, like, I'm a big guy, do you have a big version of your shirt, or is it going to look silly because I uploaded my big picture and there's a little tiny photo of the t-shirt on my body? Like, is it? And so I'm playing out the story, I'm navigating back and forth. And then they tell me, and I want all this done in the next 3 weeks. And I think, okay, another discrepancy, right? What you want and timeline don't match. What you want and budget don't match. Or even the two, what you want, right? Sometimes they want one feature and they want another feature and they don't align, right? So I want this thing totally locked down. I want an audit log and an audit trail for every single person, but I need anybody to be able to create a post for the site. And you're like, wait, hold on, what? So when I hear those discrepancies in the first call, right, I say, look, I've noticed you have several different discrepancies. I noticed there's some challenges here. This is an issue. This is a challenge. I'm giving them some advice free. And then I say, it sounds like what we need to do is actually do a discovery project, right? A fixed amount of time to dig into these, to pull them apart, and to define your actual effort, define what you want done. And there's a fixed fee for that, right? I'm going to have to charge you for that because that's my time and that's your time, and we're going to invest in doing that. When we're done, we'll have a document that tells us exactly what we're doing, and we'll have an explicit articulation of what it costs and how long it'll take. And then you can evaluate that, and you can use me, but you can also go with anyone. And this is the part of discovery projects that I really emphasize, is that at the end, we each get a decision whether we want to move forward together or not. Because even though for the most part, most discovery projects I've done, I have engaged with the client afterward, I can remember 3 or 4 times where I've turned over the discovery document and said, and now that I've seen it and what size this is and whatever, right? I don't have the bandwidth to support you going forward with the next phase, so I'll recommend you to other people. But inside, what I'm saying is, I don't really ever want to work with you again, right? There is not a good fit here. Either it's chemistry or it's like I can't charge you enough money for the amount of time I know you're going to consume, because I quoted you the effort of this thing, but I didn't quote you the effort of answering all your phone calls, and you call 6 times a day, and I'm going to have to layer that in to make this profitable. And that's going to push the price tag so high that I would rather just hand you off to someone else.
Words of wisdom. Before we continue on, I'm going to take a little commercial break, but we've got some good questions rolling in. If you're listening live and want to get your questions in, keep them coming in on Twitter with #OfficeFM or over on Google using the Q&A app. Now, as teased earlier, I want to share a little bit more about our sponsors today. We've got Pantheon, who is a WordPress and Drupal host, and their focus is on infrastructure for high performing WordPress sites. So big ass traffic sites. And Chris, you actually talked about, you shared at WooConference last week, I believe, about the ColourPop site.
Yeah, high scale WooCommerce.
Yeah, that did something crazy, like 2,000 cart ads per minute or something like that on Black Friday. But anyway, I don't know how many of you guys listening out there are going to be doing something quite in that vein. But even if you have a site that's doing a fair amount of traffic, you want to make sure that your website is built in such a way to support that. So Pantheon has a free webinar where you can go learn some more about that. And you can catch that over at cdills.me/high-speed-sites. Or if you don't want to remember that, just go over to officehours.fm website and look for episode 98, and you can find that there. Then we have got Network Solutions' new secure WordPress product. And I know a lot of us, we kind of harp on keeping our site secure and updating your plugins and whatnot. And those of you who are tuning into the show, you're probably pretty good about doing this for your own site. But think about doing this for your client site. And this would be a great tool that you could use for that. You can learn more about that at GetNetSol, SL. I'm going to just start over. GetNetSol. GetNetSol, SOL.com/office hours. And as a total aside, Chris will share this fun fact with you. Of course, Network Solutions was the very first place where you could purchase domain names back in the 90s. And I think I bought my first domain name in maybe 98 or 99. And I don't know, I'm just kind of having a proud moment where somebody that I did business with is kind of a pillar of the original web is actually sponsoring this podcast. So, yep, I might have just peed myself a little bit. Thank you, Network Solutions. All right, so moving in to some of these questions that we've got.
Can I add just one little piece?
Please.
I just did a webinar yesterday on high performance and scaling WooCommerce websites with WP Engine. We did that 2,000 add to carts a minute at WP Engine, and we just did a webinar yesterday, which I think they're rolling out today, the recording for people. So if you're definitely, Pantheon does a whole bunch with high scale. We just did a webinar. I just did a webinar yesterday on high scale for WooCommerce in case people want to check that out. Cool.
I will we'll tweet that out later, find that link if it's live. So good questions rolling in. The vendor asks, which is better, giving a quote directly or pushing clients to share their budget?
So I think it is always worth asking what someone's budget is, right? I don't think you should be bashful or ashamed to ask it. Like I said, I go back to the real world and people who've done this forever. The guy who built the pool in our backyard, I've written about this. This guy is incredible. He came over. So I asked my wife to call the vendor. I'm just going to tell you a story, and then we'll get to the
Hey, that's perfect.
Like, you know, that's going to happen. So I asked my wife to call the vendor who had done somebody else's grass in their front lawn. And I wanted to know what it would cost to do the grass in our front lawn. My son is allergic to grass, so I wanted fake grass. In California, we were in the middle of a drought, so I wanted fake grass. And I'm like, call that company and have them come over. So she had the guy come over, and she asked for the quote of the grass in the front yard. And he said, it's like, this is too small. Like, we don't do a project this size. Lesson learned, right? You have to be very comfortable to say, this is not my kind of project. Very comfortable, right? That should never go as something that you're like, well, maybe I can push them to the next level. No, just be like, I'm sorry, this square of grass is too small a project for us to be interested in. So then he asked to follow it. Now, are you doing anything in your backyard? Right? Because this was a new construction, new area. And she said, well, my husband has a lot of plans, but I don't know. I don't know if he was going to ask for the grass people to do them. And he's like, well, we do much more than grass. Could I have a look at the backyard? Right? And so she took him. Now I'm sitting in my office. I'm on calls all day. She took him into the backyard, and I mistakenly had shared with my wife my plans. So she mistakenly shared with him our plans. Now I say mistakenly because 3 hours later, I walked out of my office. I had finally had a break in calls. I walked out of my office and I walk in the kitchen where my wife is, and I said, hey, did the grass guy come, and how'd it go? And do we have a number? And the grass guy is sitting in a chair in our front room and stands up to come over. And she's like, he said the front yard is too small a project, but he'd like to talk to you about the backyard. And he waited. And I'm like, what the heck?
You got ambushed.
Well, of course he waited, right? Because what he heard about the bigger project, right, was interesting. So he waited. And if he's going to wait 2 or 3 hours for a, massive job, that's no issue to him. He's like, I'll just sit over here and I'll just do work until your husband comes out of his office. And so I walked out and I referred to all the work we wanted done. And then we came and sat down, and he said, what's your budget? And me, being an expert at this, said, I'm not negotiating with myself. What's it going to cost? Right. So I pushed it back to him. I thought I was a pro, right? I thought I was a total pro. I learned a big lesson that day because he anchored me without giving me a number. He anchored me in my own head. What he said was, well, I've done this for about 20 years. Okay. And for 20 years, what I know, what I've seen is that people have an idea of what they want, and they have an idea of the budget they have. And invariably, their budget is about half of the cost of what they want. He anchored me without ever saying a number, right? But the number that was in my head, he just doubled. And then I said, well, I'm not paying. And I said my double number, which means he knew exactly what my anchor number was. And he said, well, we don't have to go there. We can probably, and he brought his number down, but his down number was higher than my anchor, right? And so I paid 150% of my original number, right?
That man, is he for hire? Like as a sales guy?
He is, to build you a pool, and a very expensive one at that. Here's the thing, right? Before we got into that, he told me about the Johnson house. He told me about these other options. And I watched him do his work, and I just took notes because I'm like, this guy knows what he's doing. He wasn't bashful about asking what my budget was, but that didn't stop the conversation. When I said, well, I'm not going to negotiate with myself, he still had ways to maneuver. So when you ask someone, I think it's perfectly fine to say, what's your budget, right? I also think it's perfectly fine when someone says, I would prefer not to give you a number. I'd like to know what it will cost you, right? It's perfectly fine for you to then anchor them or give them a number or give them several different numbers. Now, what was great was, I had particular desires. Like I wanted a waterfall, but more than the waterfall, I wanted a cave behind the waterfall with a bench in the cave. Now you can tell that's totally extra. That's totally unrelated. So you know what they did? They brought me a price of the pool at exactly the top end of what I said, like, okay, but I'm not spending more than this. And they gave me that for the pool and the waterfall, but it didn't include the cave. For an extra $15,000, I could buy the cave with the bench and the light in the back, right? Because that's an add-on. And you know what I did? I bought the cave, right?
You bought the cave.
I wanted to see the backside of water. So, at the end of the day, right, you have to get very, very comfortable with the story you're telling, who you are, your backstory, everything else, and comfortable talking about money. right? And if you're not comfortable, you're the only one that's uncomfortable, because the rest of us use money to buy things all the time. You have to be, and you have to be able to say, I can get you this, I can't get you that. When he's doing the numbers, yeah, he's thinking some about profit margin, but he's also thinking about how many people we're going to refer him to, to him. We're also talking about the sign that's going to go in our front yard. We're also talking about, like, they literally brought, for the next 6 months, they brought people over because our awning was so big that every time someone wanted to talk about having that covered patio, they're like, can we take you to the Lema house? We were the Johnson house, right? And then they would show them the backyard and people would be like, I want all of this. And they're like, yes, because we got one reference client. Now we can get several more.
That's awesome. I love that entire story. And a good takeaway there is that, or I mean, there are multiple takeaways, but if you have a client that is reluctant to share a number, that's the perfect opportunity to tell a story and anchor them with your previous experience, that sort of thing.
Yeah. The other takeaway is you should learn lessons about your business from everyone you possibly can, ever, all the time. Take notes. Be a astute observer of how other people are doing their craft, because there's something in it. I am not a super smart guy, right? I am not a guy who comes up with original thought and comes up with original ideas and has amazing breakthrough, like, oh my God, he's so amazing. But I am a massive student of other people's smartness. And then I just say, okay, I want to refine and perfect that in my space. You don't have to be brilliant to be high performant, or to excel in your business. But you do need to be an astute observer of what other people are doing, because they may come up with the ideas that are the ones you can leverage in your business.
And not bashful about talking about money. That is great advice.
Yeah.
When you think about going to the Apple store and you say, I've got a budget of $1,000 and I want a 15-inch retina. Well, we're not going to be able to do that. Let me show you this Air.
Right. And I don't know if your listeners are old enough to remember a Chris Rock stand-up routine where he talked about, like, okay, but like, that's a whole lot of money. And then he's like, what if I just get this and but without the tires, or without the this, right? Like, he would just keep trying to negotiate down because it was a lot of money. If you're consistently hearing back from your segment that it's a whole lot of money and it's too expensive, either one of two things: you've gone out of your mind and you got to lower your price, or find a new segment. Both are options, right? But complaining about the segment you're in and the pricing you're giving to that segment, complaining will get you nowhere. Just either lower your price to fit the segment and lower the cost of doing your business, or shift segments, right? I've told this story a million times, but peanut butter, the Jiffy people, right? They figure this out really easily. Peanut butter has not changed its price in several years, right? And you're like, that's cool. I like that peanut butter doesn't change its price. Well, that's BS. What peanut butter changed was the bottle, right? If you take, no one does this, but if you take your peanut butter Jiffy plastic bottle with the blue, cap, flip it over. And when you look at the bottom, there's an indentation in the they changed the size of the bottle. You're paying more per ounce than you paid before, but they just reshaped it, right? So they lowered their costs and kept the price the same. If you want to lower your costs, right? Stop giving away content migration for free, right? Lower your costs, make it an add-on. Stop doing discovery for free. Lower your costs, make it an add-on, right? There are ways that you can bring your price down to say, look, if you can tell me exactly what you want all the way through, answer this questionnaire that's 42 pages long, I will do your website for $500, or I'll do your website for $1,000 or $5,000. But you got to fill it out. And if they're like, but I don't want to do that, you're like, great. I also offer a $2,000 discovery project where we can have these conversations and I'll fill it out for you, right? Segment the work, break it apart, and either get to a place where you've lowered your costs and therefore can lower your price to the segment you're in, or shift segments. Now, what you should know is if you shift the segment, you're also gonna have to deliver a different kind of value, right? The guy that I wanted for the pool, he didn't just dig a hole in the ground, right? He came back with 3D renderings of all of my ideas, and he had spent time in AutoCAD to build it all out. And then we were able to manipulate that a bit. And then he had to go back and do some more work. And then they came to build it. Like, he's just not a hole digger, right? He is the deliverer of my backyard dreams. And that is worth a premium price.
The deliverer of your backyard dreams. And that is going to be the key quote takeaway from this episode. Jackie has a good timely question. She says, what questions do you typically ask to help clients, or maybe stories that you tell to help clients focus on the value your solution provides versus the cost?
So in reality, I find that the biggest shift, I don't think I've ever talked about this. Wow, you're getting an exclusive right
First
here.
time
right now.
story right here.
Pay very close attention. I don't think, like some people think in order to get a value exchange to shift from cost basis to value basis, you have to tell them a particular story. The story isn't the driver. The story may be a tool. The driver is trust, right? The driver is trust. When they hand you their wallet of trust, when they hand you that dynamic that says, you are a proxy for me in the project, that's when you can charge a premium. Only when that happens. When that happens, what they're paying for is that they don't have to answer a million questions because you are their proxy. So you get to answer the questions to your team, your developers, your designers, whatever, because you fully understand their business. Now think through what that means. In order for you to be a proxy for someone else, you have to fully and immersively know their business. Those are the stories I tell. So when I'm talking to someone and they say, well, I'm building an LMS, and I'm like, I built the first LMS in 1995. In those days, it was called computer-based training, and it was a set of CDs. And I worked with a company called Macromedia to build something called Shockwave to be able to put animation and video on the web browser. And then I worked with companies to build this notion of quizzes and presentation material, which then we shared with a small company out of Boston that ended up becoming the leading player of LMSs. I don't know if you've heard about this company, right? And then, by the way, also, today you hear about the Tin Can API, but in the early days, there was a different standard, and I was part of the consortia that designed that standard, and they're like, oh my God, you know LMSs. I'm like, right. Now, by the way, we should talk about quiz banks, because I worked with this client where we actually built them quiz banks so that they could randomize the questions, because you don't want people just passing the one quiz to the next guy so that everyone's cheating. And so you want to randomize this, but you want those questions to come out of different, and they're like, oh my God, you know everything about my business. And you go, yes. And now I charge you a premium. And they go, of course I'll pay that premium. I'll pay that premium because you understand my business. You understand it maybe even better than I do. I am just getting into this. I know tennis. I want to build a tennis LMS, but I don't know anything about LMSs, and you know everything about LMSs. That's what I'm paying for. I'm not just paying for the cost of typing. I'm paying for your wealth of experience. I'm paying for you to protect me from making stupid mistakes. And whether that's an e-commerce site or an LMS site or a membership site, those are the places where I have deep experience. I tell those stories so that people go, that's what I'm paying for. I want you to be my proxy in your business or among your group of people that you're hiring. I'm going to transfer my trust to you because you're my proxy. You have my voice inside your group of developers and peers or whatever, and you're going to figure it out for me, and you're protecting me. And so I'm paying for knowledge. I'm paying for experience. I'm paying for insurance. Right? Like I'm paying literally that you're going to mitigate around the problems that other developers won't even know that is an issue. Right? When I was on the call yesterday, I was on the webinar yesterday talking about e-commerce. I'm like, you know, that smart coupons plugin, it doesn't scale so well. And there are people like, what are you talking about? Like, I just assumed that because it was sold by WooThemes that it would scale. And I'm like, no, it won't scale. And so what happens? My inbox fills up right away. Like 3 people right away. They're like, so how do I do this? Right? They're going to pay, right? They want to pay for, can I hire you just to consult? Can I hire you just to solve this one little area? Give me the advice I need. That's when you're shifting, because trust now has changed. But when you get into that, we talked about earlier, when you get in that whole, like, they're talking, I'm not listening, I'm thinking of the solution, and I come back and I start putting it together, and I'm pricing based on my own internal cost. Right? I mean, that's what we're doing. Like, we're shifting back to cost-based pricing because we're like, well, I need that CPT and I need that plugin, and then I'm going to outsource this to that. And so it's going to cost me about $2,000. And so I'll charge them $3,000. And you're like, but you were doing cost-based pricing. So why are you frustrated when the customer is doing cost-based pricing? The better move is shift your dynamic to making sure that you can demonstrate you're a proxy for them. Making sure that you can be their voice when they're not around. When you can do that, you're a partner. When you can do that, they hand over trust. And when they hand over trust, you can charge for value.
Boom. Drop the mic once again in this episode. I love the activity going on Twitter. Folks are basically, if this were church, people are shouting out amen via Twitter. this is a question of my own, but you just hit on something, which is sort of your depth of knowledge in some very specific places. As a general rule, do you, and maybe this is a leading question, but do you recommend going deep versus wide in terms of areas of expertise?
So yes and yes. The reality is the differentiator that I have compared to most people, and I don't really try and compete with most people, and I don't call myself a freelancer as much as I've been doing freelance work for years and years. I don't really think of myself that way because mostly I'm an advisor, consultant, coach. But the reality is I'm turning 46 this year, and I started working with the web when I was in my early 20s. So late 94, right? I joined Berkeley Lab, and we started building stuff on the internet. And so it's unfair, right, for me to say, yes, develop deep expertise. And once you develop one well of expertise, then go develop the next one and then the next one. Because when you've been doing this for 21 years, you're like, of course you should, you should spend 20 years. And of course someone else goes, but I'm not even that old. Like I haven't even spent that kind of time. So then I can't earn any money. So the reality is varied experience is helpful. Depth of experience is helpful, but above everything, being that proxy for that customer. So that active listening, that compelling understanding of their story. Hard work and discipline will outpace intelligence every time. And the benefit of hard work and discipline is that it builds experience. So I don't care if your first 2 years suck and you're barely making any money, right? In that scenario, build up an arsenal of inexpensive sites where you've solved problems, but you've solved similar kinds of problems 20, 30 times a year for 2 years, because then you do have some level of expertise in year 3. It doesn't have to take forever, but it does take some time. But what you don't want to do is you don't want to scatter all over the place for a year and a half and then the world sucks because I can't make $100,000 or $200,000 a year, right? That's not how the equation works.
Good answer, sir. We got time for one more question here, and I think Tanya brings up a good one. She says, "How do you share your story and provide the proof to back it up?" Which I think is an interesting question. I mean, has anybody ever asked you for proof?
I don't know that people have asked for proof, but I know that people have called around to get a testimonial or to get some kind of sense that I'm not BSing. Though I will say this: the way you tell the story will often articulate the experience, right? So if I'm telling the story and I'm like, look, here's what we know about the IRS and compliance with the IRS as it relates to understanding your potential, like what is the amount of money that you make, your income compared to the AMGI, which is the average gross income of that community, and then compared to how the IRS looks at that to determine whether or not you can move into this subsidized housing. The fact that I just said AMGI, subsidized housing, Section 8, and this process, right? And the way the IRS calculates this. And so if you have a child that's only there part-time, the bar is at 50%, but if it's below 50%, they won't qualify as an extra person in the household. And the household is defined by people living there, but not actually family members, even though the form is talking about family members. The fact that I know that nuance compared to someone else says, oh no, you've done this before. Like in that scenario, I don't need a testimonial. I can get on stage and talk to you about affordable housing and subsidized housing because I lived in that space for years. And we would buy the 500-page book that Novogradac would publish every 2 years on the IRS calculations for determining stuff, and we'd memorize it. And so me and a buddy would get on stage, we'd speak at a conference, and everyone would come up and say, we want to buy your product. They were buying our product because they're like, clearly, the space, it better than our own staff. You're going to keep us in compliance. And if you've coded all that logic into software, then you've protected us. And I'm like, that's the value proposition. Buy my software because we've protected you, and we'll protect you forever. In that scenario, when you tell the story the right way, the depth is clear, right? The depth is just clear. Now, if you're just saying, I built a website for $20,000 and it made a killing, or yeah, I worked with a customer and they have a membership site and it has like tons of people. These are crappy stories. Learn to tell a better story, right? That's the core there. But But the other dynamic that Tanya brings up is that at some point people will want to know, like, is this guy for real, right? Is this person for real? And so having references that you can point to is helpful, but more importantly, it's how they find you that I find becomes really helpful, right? If someone comes to Carrie Dills and says, I have a membership question, I'm trying to build a membership site and I have a problem. Carrie Dills has one of two choices. Carrie Dills can actually say, here's what I think you should do. Or Carrie Dills can say, well, I would think about this, but have you talked to Chris Lema? And maybe they don't come to Chris Lema right away, but then they go over to, say, Brian Bourne, and they go, hey, Brian, I have a question about a membership site. I want to do this stuff. And Brian Bourne says, well, I don't know, but have you talked to Chris Lema? So what happens when they go to the third person and they're like, well, have you talked to Chris Lema? At that point, they're like, well, who the heck is this Chris Lema? And clearly I should talk to him, right? And that shifts the stories I have to tell because people are walking in anchored already. They're walking in anchored with whatever this guy's saying. It comes from a place of knowledge and it comes from a place where other people respect him, right? Part of the reason people ask, well, why do you go to these WordCamps, or why do you go to these events, or why do you speak at these places? Partly it's, in some way it's to connect with new people, but other times it's to connect with my friends and to make sure that I'm sharing with them some of the things I've been doing or what I've been finding out, because then they're like, oh, that's right. Chris is, I'm taking a corner in your brain for some things. And so if someone comes to you and you reference me, or someone comes to someone else and they reference that authority position, taking that corner in certain spaces, allows the people who come to me to come in kind of pre-anchored. And then I have a lot less work to do because they're like, well, okay, I get it. Like you're expensive, but you're worth it. And so let's go solve this problem.
It's funny that you give that illustration, because I actually just today somebody had messaged me on LinkedIn about something, and I said, don't know, but you should definitely talk to Chris Lema about that.
Thank you. I'll send you a cut.
Yeah, send me the commission if it works out.
As soon as I get it.
Well, unfortunately, we are at the end of our hour, and Chris, you've shared so much value in the hour that we've had. So thank you for that. For you guys who are tuned in, listening live, or even if you're catching this after the fact, you can always go back and rewatch over on officehours.fm. Actually relaunched the site yesterday, and now I know for sure that the video works across iOS and some other devices as well. There were problems earlier. So you will have that problem no more. You can watch Chris from your iPad while looking at the backside of water in your cave, if you would like to do that. All right. Well, Chris, where can people find you online to just follow up and say hello?
ChrisLema.com is the best place. There's a contact form there. On that website at ChrisLema.com, you'll also see that I answer people's questions and pay by the minute. So you can always find me over at clarity.fm as well. And I am on Twitter. That's also the easiest way to connect with me.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Chris. It is always a pleasure to see you, and I'll have you back on the show again soon so we can get to the rest of the questions that are in the queue.
Awesome.
Thanks, guys, for tuning in today, and we'll see you next week. Bye.
Bye.